Modern warfare is not won by the side with the most missiles. It is won by the side that can see the clearest, communicate the fastest, and deny that same ability to its enemy.
Now, Iran doesn't have a lethal air force, nor does it have a powerful navy. What it does have is a massive missile arsenal. Missiles that can fly all over West Asia and beyond.
Weapons are the fist, networks are the nervous system, and right now the most powerful military alliance in human history runs that nervous system through infrastructure it does not own, cannot fully control, and cannot independently operate if the country that built it changes the terms. So who actually controls NATO's nervous system? Europe is starting to understand that, and the response is not loud. It is not announced at summits. It is not celebrated in press conferences. It is happening quietly, in procurement contracts, in satellite launches, in software programs. And in closed-door conversations between defense ministers who are no longer comfortable with the assumptions that held for decades. What changed, and why now? This is not a story about tanks. It is not a story about fighter jets. This is a story about control. Who controls the data? Who routes the signals? Who holds the keys to the systems modern militaries depend on every single day? Because once you understand that, you understand something most people miss. The most important battlefield in the next war will not be in the sky or on the ground. It will be inside the networks underneath everything else. Here is the question European defense planners have been forced to answer. If NATO's nervous system was severed from Washington, even partially, what would actually break first? Stay with that. Yeah, because the answer changes everything about how you see the alliance. NATO looks unified, seamless, integrated. Decades of exercises, coordinated responses, and shared doctrine reinforce that image at every turn. But underneath that surface, the system is not neutral. The communications architecture that ties the alliance together was designed, built, and is substantially operated by the United States. The satellite networks carrying secure military traffic across the Atlantic run heavily through American systems. The encryption standards protecting classified data between Allied headquarters trace back to American cryptographic frameworks. The targeting platforms used during coalition air operations were developed in the United States, hosted on American infrastructure, and subject to American operational decisions. Does that sound like an independent alliance to you? None of this happened through deception. It happened through logic. After the Second World War, only one Western power had the industrial capacity, the technological depth, and the financial resources to build a global military communications network. European nations, still rebuilding from destruction, were in no position to compete with that, so they joined a system that worked, and for 80 years it served its purpose. The Cold War was deterred, the alliance held together through every crisis thrown at it. But there is a difference between an alliance that works and an alliance that is independent. And for 80 years, that difference was invisible. Because as long as Washington and Brussels pointed in the same direction, the dependency did not feel like dependency. It felt like a partnership. That changed when the questions started coming from Washington itself. Not from analysts, not from think tanks, from the officials making decisions. Questions about American commitment to European defense. Questions about burden sharing. Questions about whether the terms of the transatlantic relationship that had governed everything since 1949 were still the terms Washington wanted. And when European planners heard those questions, they were forced to ask one of their own. If we needed to operate without American support, or with reduced American support, or with support operating under conditions we did not set, what would actually break? The answer was uncomfortable. The communications would degrade. The satellite coverage would narrow. The shared intelligence platforms would operate under conditions defined elsewhere. And in the most serious scenario, the ability to coordinate a European military response to a crisis on European soil would be constrained by decisions made on the other side of the Atlantic. That is not a hypothetical built to alarm. That is a structural reality that European defense planners have now acknowledged openly enough that the response has moved from strategy papers into funded programs with delivery schedules. The specific systems at the center of this concern are not the ones that appear in news coverage. Nobody photographs communications satellites at defense exhibitions the way they photograph fighter jets. But the people who run military operations understand something the headlines miss. What happens to a fighter jet without a functioning data link? It becomes an expensive aircraft flying blind. A missile battery without reliable command and control cannot be fully coordinated. A headquarters without secure communications is a building full of officers who cannot direct the forces assigned to them. The network is not supported. The network is the operation. Military communications infrastructure divides into layers. At the top are the satellite constellations providing coverage across wide geographic areas. Below that are the ground-based relay systems, the hardened fiber connections, the tactical radio networks, and the encrypted data links connecting aircraft to ground forces and ground forces to command centers. Threading through all of it are the software platforms managing access, routing information, and translating raw data into the situational displays commanders use to make decisions. Each layer presents the same question: who built it? Who manages it? Who controls access to it? Who can issue an update, a restriction, or a shutdown that changes how it behaves? Examined layer by layer, the answers reveal a level of external control over European military communications that has no equivalent in how European nations think about any other sovereign capability. Consider satellite communications. Europe has civilian infrastructure. The Galileo navigation system provides positioning data independent of American GPS. But does that extend to military-grade secure communications? No. Military-grade satellite communications, carrying the most sensitive operational traffic, have historically relied heavily on American systems and on capacity leased from American commercial providers operating under American regulatory frameworks. When European forces deploy to a theater of operations, a significant portion of their satellite bandwidth flows through systems where the ultimate decisions about access, capacity allocation, and continuity sit outside European control. In a high-escalation scenario, not a worst case, just an unexpected case, what does that mean operationally? European military commanders could find their communications bandwidth reduced, restricted, or reprioritized in ways they had no authority to influence. Not through hostility, not through betrayal, simply through a dependency playing out exactly as dependencies do. The encryption layer presents a related problem. The standards governing how NATO communications are secured, the certificates authenticating connections between allied systems, and the hardware implementing those standards at the classified level all have deep roots in American cryptographic policy. What does that mean for an ally that wants genuine communications privacy? An ally wishing to communicate in ways that remain genuinely private from American intelligence faces significant technical barriers, because the systems were never designed with that requirement in mind. They were designed for an alliance where American leadership was assumed to be permanent, and where information sharing with the United States was considered a feature. Not everyone still considers it a feature. The targeting networks add another dimension. During major coalition operations over the last 2 decades, Allied aircraft sharing the same airspace coordinated through American platforms. The common operational picture allowing a French Rafale and an American aircraft to work against the same target set ran through systems where the architecture was American and where the data flow was visible to American intelligence assets. Was that capability valuable? Enormously. Was it free? Not in any meaningful sense. European participation in coalition operations generated a detailed record of European tactics, sensor capabilities, and operational response patterns, all residing on American-controlled infrastructure. In peacetime, that is an acceptable cost of interoperability. In a high-intensity conflict on European soil, it is an operational security problem of the first order. And this is where the reality of modern warfare cuts through the comfortable assumptions of alliance management. If the network is controlled by someone else, then your military is not fully yours. It is operating on permission. That line is not a metaphor. It is a description of how access-controlled infrastructure actually functions. The permissions are not always explicit. They are often invisible, embedded in contract terms, in technical standards, in the administrative decisions of system operators who may be located thousands of kilometers away from the conflict they are supporting. So what does a rational defense establishment do when it maps that problem? It builds alternatives. European planners have spent the last several years mapping exactly where those permissions sit. And the map has driven the programs now receiving funding at levels that would have seemed unrealistic 5 years ago. The largest and most consequential response is at the satellite layer. The European Union has approved and is funding a constellation called IRIS², Infrastructure for Resilience, Interconnectivity, and Security by Satellite. This is not a civilian program with some military applications. It was designed from the outset to provide secure government communications operating independently of American infrastructure. The constellation is intended to cover European and Arctic approaches, provide redundant communications links for military and government users, and operate under governance structures where decision-making authority sits inside European institutions. Why does the scale of that ambition matter? Because it represents a recognition that leasing capacity from American operators and relying on American military satellite access is no longer an acceptable foundation for European security communications. Owning the infrastructure changes the dependency equation, fundamentally, permanently. Alongside the satellite program, European nations are investing in ground-based alternatives that reduce reliance on the shared NATO infrastructure running through American systems. Hardened fiber networks, tactical communication systems designed to operate in degraded satellite environments, data centers located in European jurisdiction, not subject to the legal frameworks governing American commercial or government infrastructure. The encryption layer is being addressed separately. European cryptographic agencies are developing standards and hardware implementing security independent of American design systems. This is technically complex work requiring years to complete, but it is work that has accelerated considerably as the political pressure to achieve genuine communication sovereignty has intensified. And the software layer, the most strategically sensitive of all, the systems creating shared tactical pictures, routing targeting data, and connecting the nodes of a modern military network have historically been American products, integrated into NATO operations under American license terms. European programs developing alternatives to these platforms are now receiving funding at levels that would have been unthinkable before the political fractures of the last several years became visible. This is what a serious strategic shift looks like. Not declarations, not ultimatums, procurement contracts, satellite launches, cryptographic programs, software alternatives. The dependency that built NATO's nervous system over 80 years is being quietly, methodically, deliberately dismantled. Not because Europe has turned against its ally, but because for the first time European defense planners are asking a question that nobody asked when the alliance was built. What happens to our military if the terms change? They did not like the answer. And until the moment those systems matter most, the work will already be done. One question for the comments: does Europe's push for communication sovereignty strengthen NATO or fracture it? Drop your position below. Subscribe if you want this level of analysis on the systems most defense coverage ignores.